Welcome to Public Health on Call, a podcast from the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health, where we bring evidence, experience, and perspective to make sense of today's leading health challenges. If you have questions or ideas for us, please send an email to publichealthquestion@jhu.edu. That's publichealthquestion@jhu.edu for future podcast episodes.
This is Lindsay Smith-Rogers. Today, an insider's history of one of the most important scientific documents of the 20th century, the 1964 Surgeon General's Report on Smoking. Dr. Josh Sharfstein interviews Donald Shopland, one of the original staffers of the Advisory Committee on Smoking and Health, about a report that was so damning it had to be released with all sorts of cloak-and-dagger preparations and almost didn't happen at all. Let's listen.
Donald Shopland, thank you so much for joining me today on Public Health on Call to talk about the 1964 report of the Advisory Committee to the U.S. Surgeon General on smoking and health. And I want to ask you first to take us back to that time, 1960, 1961, 1962. What was the state of tobacco use in the United States back then?
In the early 1960s, the behavior itself was ubiquitous in U.S. society. At the time, about half of the adult population were regular cigarette smokers. And of course, a large percentage of teens were smoking as well. It was pretty much a behavior that was practiced everywhere in society among old and the young, the educated and the not, the wealthy and not. And it was pretty much everywhere. You could smoke pretty much everywhere you wanted to. There were no restrictions whatsoever.
Now, around that time, there were some concerning reports about the potential link to cancer and other health concerns. How did it come about that there was an advisory committee to issue a more definitive report on the link between smoking and health?
Sure. A number of national voluntary health agencies had written both to the White House and even to the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare, asking that they undertake a complete review of all the evidence. Because as you say, a number of reviews had been published up to this point in time, but it had not really settled the question as to what the health risks really were. And that was why Surgeon General Luther Terry decided to establish this advisory committee.
Now, is it true that the actual origin of the committee had something to do with a question asked to President Kennedy?
Yes, a couple of months earlier in early 1962, the Royal College of Physicians had issued a report on smoking and health that had gotten some publicity in the U.S., and a reporter working for the Evening Star asked President Kennedy about his administration's views on the topic, and Kennedy was sort of caught off guard by it, and he said, I didn't really have an answer to that question, but that he would get back to the reporter. And then he, of course, turned to the Surgeon General and asked Dr. Luther Terry to look into the matter, and Terry decided to establish the advisory committee.
Now, who was on the advisory committee?
It was a variety of people with experience in a number of different disciplines. There was an epidemiologist, there was a couple pathologists, there was a statistician, and these represented a sort of variety of disciplines that was able to actually sift through a large amount of data and undertake a more complete review of the topic. The thing that made it unique is that the 10 individuals chosen did not have any expertise in the topic whatsoever. In fact, that was almost a prerequisite for them to serve on the committee, because they were trying to eliminate, to the extent they could, any type of investigator bias.
Right. So President Kennedy gets this question. He says, we're going to have the U.S. government's answer. And the Surgeon General appoints a committee, people who really haven't thought so much about the question, in order to get an answer with credibility for the American people. Would you say that's a fair summary?
Yes, that's correct. In fact, to take it even a step further, when Luther Terry decided to establish the committee, he actually pulled in all the stakeholders for a planning meeting, and that planning meeting also included the tobacco industry. And they came up with a list of about 155 individuals who could potentially serve as nominees to the committee. And it was from that list that the Office of the Surgeon General chose the 10 members to actually serve on the committee.
So I understand that 5 members of the committee were cigarette smokers themselves and others may have used tobacco products. Is that right?
Yeah, I think 5 were smokers. I can't remember whether all 5 were cigarette smokers. I know one member, Dr. Mickey Lemater, was a pipe smoker. So there was at least 4 cigarette smokers and maybe 5 that, you're talking, 5 out of the 10 of the committee members were current smokers at the time.
And did I understand you right that some of them might have been on that list from the tobacco industry?
One of the things that happened is that they wanted to make sure this had, I won't say the backing of the industry, but they wanted to make sure that they were not going to charge that the committee might be biased. And so there was a concerted effort on the part of the Public Health Service to choose at least one member from the list that the industry submitted to serve on the committee. Now, having said that, the Public Health Service went through a fairly detailed vetting process to make sure that no matter who sat on that committee, they did not have any type of inherent bias and had never taken a stand on the issue prior to their selection of serving on that committee.
Right. Now, you wrote this great book about the committee's work and from the vantage point of someone who actually helped that committee. So could you explain when you joined the effort and what your job was?
Well, I was just a young kid at the time. I was working for the National Library of Medicine, and that is where the committee and its staff had its headquarters, and it's actually where all the committee meetings took place. The review itself, or the committee itself, was actually conducting a literature review, so what better place to do that than is to have access to that body of information through the National Library of Medicine. I was eventually detailed to work full-time on the committee, probably in the late summer of 1963, and then stayed for the duration until the report was released on January the 11th, 1964. And my primary duty was to actually access the different studies from the library's holdings and make that available to the committee as part of the review.
Sounds like an important piece because the committee chose to do a pretty in-depth review, right? They could have just summarized what other people did, but they felt, based on your book, I got the sense that they really wanted to break new ground in thoroughness of reviewing the evidence on smoking and health.
Well, one of the either advantages or disadvantages, depending on how you want to look at it, because this committee had no expertise on the subject matter, they were pretty much starting from ground zero. So they almost had to, by the nature of the review, really go back and look at all of the evidence and look at it with a new angle, if you will. And they wanted to make sure that it was going to be completely different from anything that had been done previously. So they end up actually having to review almost 7,000 studies that comprised a database back then on the relationship of smoking to different diseases.
Now, it goes without saying that you didn't just search Medline and send them the electronic files by email in the early 1960s. Was there a lot of copying involved?
There was a great deal of copying. I said, I wish I knew how many trees we killed, given the amount of paperwork that we created. Back then, there was a couple of volumes that have been published. One was a very in-depth review by a group of authors by the name of Larson, Hagen, Silvet, that had reviewed all of the data up through 1958. And then the National Library of Medicine went back to any holdings from 1958 forward and found any new articles that related to the review. So the committee had the Larson book to use as a resource, and then they also used the National Library of Medicine bibliographers to go back and search the data from 1958 through 1963. And it was from that total database that we found that there was about 7,000 different studies that made up the total literature base on smoking and health at the time.
I'm envisioning a huge filing cabinet. Now, as the committee is sorting through all that evidence, a few challenges come up. One of them is the effort by the tobacco industry to keep tabs on the group and wanting to continually meet with the group and have the group meet with its scientists. And at some point, the committee stopped doing that. Could you explain what was going on there?
Well, from the very start of the study, there was a concerted effort to try to get as much information from the various tobacco companies as they could. This fell on the shoulders of both the staff as well as a couple of members of the committee itself who made routine contacts with their contacts in the industry, trying to get more and more data that the committee thought was important if they were going to be able to say that they've reviewed the totality of the evidence. Unfortunately, what the committee found out is that the tobacco industry itself, even though they had a huge amount of data, as we found out years later, they shared almost none of the important information with the committee and pretty much only shared with them a small amount of material that the committee did not find helpful whatsoever. And after making repeated contacts with the industry, they finally just gave up and said that there was just no sense trying to get information out of them if they were not willing to be more open with how they were going to share that information with the committee. And from that point on, they pretty much made no further contact with the industry.
Got it. Now, there was also a critical moment that you describe in the book where the committee meets with an official from HHS, at the time HEW, Health Education and Welfare. Now, that's the same department now known as the Department of Health and Human Services. And that official tells them they've got to wrap it up, that all this work that they'd set out for themselves, the 7,000 papers, they're not going to have time to finish. They should just write the report. And the committee then responds. What does the committee do?
Well, let me first say this, that until we started doing this book, I was not aware of what occurred at that May meeting and did not find about it until we were writing the book. And it was obviously something that was an important chapter, both for the report itself and for the history of smoking control. But what actually occurred is that at the second day of that May meeting, the Assistant Surgeon General, a fellow by the name of James Hundley, who had chaired or co-chaired all meetings of the committee, announced that they had to wrap up the work immediately and issue a report. As you probably read in the book, the committee was just incensed over this and actually ended up tossing the Assistant Surgeon General out of their meeting and went into an executive session. And it was at that executive session they decided that they and they alone were going to issue the report, and they were not going to issue the report until they had completed their work entirely. And that is what they essentially told Dr. Hundley. And they actually threatened to resign and go to the press that afternoon and let everybody know that they had been essentially told to do something that they were not willing to do, which was to issue this report prematurely, which was against everything that they had been told and had been assured by Dr. Terry when they signed up to actually be on that committee. And I can tell you that you had 10 very angry men at that meeting who were just incensed that the Public Health Service would renege on their promise of being totally independent with no time limit as to when they would issue their report.
Got it. So the Surgeon General had told them, this is your report. This is not a report necessarily of the Surgeon General. Some people think of it as the Surgeon General's report, but a report of the advisory committee, and that you have the time and resources that you need to give your independent opinion. And then someone from the Surgeon General's staff showed up and said something different, leading to this incredible moment.
That's correct. As I said, Dr. Hundley was the chair, the co-chair of every single meeting, so he knew where things stood in terms of the report compilation process. And to this day, no one can figure out exactly what prompted this, other than the fact that they probably were more concerned about the process taking too long rather than the actual content of the report itself. Now, if that was really the genesis of them actually trying to prod the committee into working faster or not, or what was actually behind it, no one really knows. The thing that I found most astounding about it is that nobody on the committee bothered to actually contact Dr. Terry to find out if this was something that he had authorized or something that he knew about or was behind. And to this day, no one really knows if Dr. Terry knew what was going on.
It's pretty amazing because it suggests that history came within a hair's breadth of not getting this report.
Very much so. If the committee had not done what they had done and forced the Public Health Service to back down, we would probably be having a very different conversation today if we'd have a conversation at all, because the report would never have been written.
So I want to ask you about some unsung heroes. You mentioned that there are 10 men. So you had 10 men on this committee. It was not diverse, but there were some unsung heroes. And you mentioned about Mrs. Mildred Bull. Can you explain who she is?
She was a staffer, and she was one of the original hires by Dr. Peter Hamill, who was the medical coordinator. And it was Dr. Hamill that was really the chief architect for the committee and the report. He was the one that actually ended up researching and vetting all 10 members of the committee, and was the one that actually did the selection of those 10 members and forwarded that to the Surgeon General and the White House for their approval. And Mildred was one of those very first hires. She was a very key individual. She ended up having a really larger role within the staff of the committee than what a lot of people knew about. And then later on, during the process of putting the report together, Dr. Hamill actually had to leave the project immediately because of a health condition. And they had to call in another person to actually finish off the work with the committee. And Mildred was the person that was able to keep things going and was the person that really helped out in that transition between Dr. Hamill and Dr. Guthrie, who took over for him. And she deserved a lot of the credit for actually being able to get the report out when it came out. She was a true unsung hero.
What was she like?
Well, she was a very short lady. She wasn't even 5 foot tall, but she was had a very domineering personality. She actually ended up being what I would consider being the unofficial staff supervisor. We had a fairly large staff. Unfortunately, almost all the staff was barred, and so we were constantly shuttling people from other agencies in and out of the project. And that job fell on Mildred to be the person who actually provided that kind of leadership for the staffing as they came in and out of the project. And she also worked very closely both with the committee and with the professional staff to make sure that they had what they needed. And it was a very, very tough job. And at the time, Mildred was pregnant, and she actually ended up delivering her third child right before Christmas as the committee was wrapping up the report. And she was the one that probably was a key staff person during the entire project.
Well, thank you. Thank you for bringing her to life. The committee did some really important work. The committee, in order to answer the question about the relationship between smoking and health, came up with principles of causal association, whether an exposure like cigarette smoking causes health harms. And they created criteria, including the consistency of the association, the strength of the association, the specificity of the association, and the coherence of the association. And those were criteria that really have stood the test of time in many ways.
Well, let's just talk about the criteria for causality for just a minute, because it was one thing that actually separated that report from any previous report, either on the topic of smoking or anything else for that matter, because it was the committee knew, I think, from the very beginning that just to issue another report was probably not going to fully answer the question that they were being asked to answer. And they came up with the idea that they probably had to have some way of evaluating the evidence so that when they reached a conclusion, they could say, well, this is the criteria by which we judge that association. And so the criteria for causality was the one thing that they fell back on that allowed them to make a judgment, for instance, that smoking had a cause and effect relationship with whatever the disease was, whether it was lung cancer, heart disease, lung disease, or whatever. And it was that criteria that they applied to the evidence to be able to reach the judgment and say, here is not only what we're concluding, but this is why we're concluding that. And it was really the cornerstone for that report.
And so what did the committee find about the relationship between smoking and health?
Well, it found a causal connection between smoking and a number of different chronic diseases. Obviously, lung cancer probably being the most important. It also found a causal relationship between smoking and cancer of other sites, and for chronic bronchitis, and for a number of other, so I won't say less important, but other diseases as well. It also found an association, even though they did not conclude it reached causal significance yet, but became very close to reaching that for the relationship between smoking and coronary heart disease, which at that time, as now, is probably the largest killer of mankind in the U.S. But they said that they thought that the association was so important that the public should feel that for the purpose of preventive medicine, they should assume that the relationship is in fact causal, even though they did not in fact conclude that. The committee also found that smoking was also associated with an increase in the overall death rate, which was a very important consideration at that time, that it not just increased the risk for certain diseases, but it actually had an effect on the overall death rate.
So these are bombshell findings, right? You have an independent committee that the president indirectly or directly has asked for, people who are not involved in the subject, people who did this enormous amount of research, established these principles, made these findings about a behavior that, as you said, half of adults were participating in.
Most definitely so. If you also look at other types of measures in terms of what impact that report had, if you look at what we call per capita consumption, and per capita consumption is nothing more than the total number of cigarettes being consumed divided by the number of adults in the population. 1963, the year before the committee issued a report, ended up being the peak year for per capita consumption. And after 1963, per capita consumption went on a downward turn that is still occurring. And I'll just give you a real quick figure. In 1963, per capita consumption stood at 4,345 cigarettes per adult in the U.S. And in last year, in 2023, that figure was below 800 cigarettes per adult. A huge downturn.
It really had an enormous impact. It changed the way the country thought about cigarettes. I wonder, when you were there, because you were there at the time that this report came out, whether you all had a sense of how important a report this would be.
I think as the process of doing the report went on, and as more and more, quote, hype was seen in the press about it, you knew that this was going to be a major event, if you will. And the fact that we had so many people trying to get access to that report, that you just knew that it was something that was not out of the ordinary. And the fact that they decided to release this report on a Saturday morning so as not to affect the stock market, I think just added to the hype and the anticipation. And of course, as we all know, that press conference was attended by literally hundreds of reporters, and it became a major news story for weeks after the report was released, and just had an enormous impact on the American public.
And it had to be printed in secret.
Yeah, they were so concerned about leaks that Dr. Guthrie, who, as I said, had taken over for Dr. Hamill, had negotiated with the government printing office that as they went through the printing process, and back then we're talking about you had to go through what we called cold set type. So you had to go through galley proofs, then page proofs into a final printing. And to make sure that none of the report got prematurely leaked, he had the government printing office identify several vendors in and around the Washington, D.C. area. And they actually printed the report in the evening after work hours with an armed guard posted so that nothing could be leaked about the report prematurely. They even had to have burn bags. And so that any scrap of paper that was generated during the printing process had to be burned that evening at the end of the print run. And that was done for both the galley proofs, the page proofs, and the final printing itself. It was, at the time, the only non-military civilian report that was treated as a top secret document.
I think it'd be fair to say that this report was one of those important health documents of the 20th century. And as I understand it, this was one of your first jobs out of high school to work on this.
Well, as I said, I was working for the National Library of Medicine at the time, and that's a federal agency. And that was my first job, but I'd only been working there for a couple of months before I was tapped to work full-time for the committee. It was a very intense time. There's no two ways about it, but it ended up being probably, as you said, one of the more important documents of the 20th century. And as one of the things we point out in the book, if you look at the books for the 20th century, the New York Public Library published a list of the most important works of the past 100 years, and it listed the 1964 report along with such works as Einstein's book on relativity, Rachel Carson's Silent Spring, and other similar scientific works.
Well, it really is incredible, and what a job to get right out of high school. And it would be fair to say changed the course of your career? I know of your work in tobacco control for many years after.
Yeah, one of the things that happened after the report was released is that Luther Terry established an agency within the Public Health Service called the National Clearinghouse for Smoking and Health that later became known as the U.S. Office on Smoking and Health. And that organization was then charged with putting out an annual report on the health consequences of smoking that became known as the annual Surgeon General's report. A lot of people don't realize that was a congressionally mandated report. It was actually a federal law that required it. So I got on the ground floor of that and actually had major responsibility for the next 18 reports. But I know the last report that I did was the 1986 report that we did under the agencies of Dr. C. Everett Koop, and he was Surgeon General, and that was on the health consequences of involuntary smoking. So I sort of came full circle from working on the first report that documented the health risk among smokers to documenting the health risk among non-smokers.
Well, your career is tremendous. This book is tremendous. And the story of the 1964 report is really a fantastic tale of public health in action. Thank you so much for joining me today.
I really appreciate it. And I would like to put in a plug that people can access our book for free if they just go to the UC Health Humanities Press website. It's a free download. There is no charge, and anybody can access it and read it for free.
Fantastic. Thank you.
You're quite welcome.
Public Health on Call is a podcast from the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health, produced by Joshua Sharfstein, Lindsay Smith-Rogers, Stephanie Desmond, and Grace Fernandez-Ciceri. Audio production by J.B. Arbogast, Holly Cardinale, Spencer Greer, Matthew Martin, and Philip Porter, with support from Chip Hickey. Distribution by Nick Moran. Production management by Catherine Ricardo. Social media run by Grace Fernandez-Ciceri. Analytics by Eliza Rosen. If you have questions or ideas for us, please send us an email to publichealthquestion@jhu.edu. That's publichealthquestion@jhu.edu for future podcast episodes. Thank you for listening.